Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I'm just doing a little follow-up video on this Aria 12-string. Starting off at this weird angle because I just happened to kind of strategically place this mirror and flashlight just so that you could kind of see the bridge plate retainer that we put in this 12-string here. That bridge plate retainer was to replace this obnoxious piece of mahogany that was living under the bridge. This was tack glued in there, and kind of I think that this may have been a thing for either reducing belly or acting as a bridge plate retainer, like maybe both. I'm not sure what the goal with this was, but putting a quarter-inch hunk of mahogany underneath your guitar soundboard is probably not going to do much for your tone. But overall, this repair came out great. This is a pretty good success story in terms of what it is. The frets were all pretty low, but they're all level, and so I didn't have to go in here and do any work, so that's good. The nut didn't end up getting replaced. It's plastic. I'd like to pull that out, but honestly, it's got a 0 fret, so the nut's not really acting as a nut anyway. Probably fine. This is just mainly here to keep the spacing of the strings at this point. Did have to add a washer to the truss rod to get a little bit more movement out of the neck, because the neck was a little bit forward bowed, as I would expect for something like this. Older 12-string guitars tend to get forward bow a lot worse than 6-string guitars for obvious reasons. And we also did a full pocket shim in the neck pocket here, which was cool because this guitar had a really terrible neck angle. And rather than dealing with trying to reset the neck on an Aria, which is a whole big can of worms, we can go in there and just install a full pocket shim and call it good. So, you know, this is going to be a pretty great guitar. It's probably not in tune, but I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit for you. Oh yeah, that G especially, but yeah, it's got a little bit of a voice in it, you know? It's going to be a really cool guitar. And able to get the action down super nice and low, too. I would have liked to have gotten it a little lower than this. Generally speaking, this is about what I would shoot for on an acoustic guitar, but on a 12-string, I'll usually try to go a little bit lower just because people tend to not have the physical strength to really pound on these to the point that they start buzzing, and so I usually shoot for something closer to an electric action on these guys here, just because you can get away with it and it feels very nice when a 12-string has very low action because it's a 12-string. But yeah, I think that this customer is going to be pretty happy with the way that this went, considering that they picked this guitar up for not too much. Oh, and I guess I'll go over the inlays too, since we repaired those. See if I can get the camera to focus on them. Yeah, so ended up kind of pushing these in. The way that I did this repair on the inlays was to basically take my fingers and a piece of wax paper and to push the inlays down while I had injected thin super glue around them to get them to tack themselves down first. And then after I had gotten them to tack themselves down, I'm using the wax paper so that I can pull my finger away and apply pressure. After I got that done, I would go in and fill that in with some medium viscosity super glue and just kind of fill it in, sometimes using a little bit of ebony or rosewood dust to kind of fill in gaps where the inlays had shrunk. But these came out looking pretty nice. They're not lifting up anymore. Still a little bit of gaps, but you know, even the good ones had gaps, and they all have gaps anyway. So not going in trying to make everything perfect, though I will say that the ones that I redid are a little bit nicer looking than the ones that were in there initially. One thing we also did was pull some hardware out of the bridge. So these two screws were holding in that big mahogany plate. And then these two bolts down here were just the standard bolts that kind of live underneath these dot inlays. And I just took those out because just doing a proper bridge reglue, like, you're not going to need the bolts. Those bolts are largely there for manufacturing purposes, just because they act as kind of a clamp in the factory. So when they glue it down, they tighten the bolt underneath, and that kind of holds. It's kind of the same thing when you do, like, I don't know if you've ever done like a rough carpentry joint like this, where you apply glue to a piece of wood and then you screw them both together and you just leave the screw in. It's kind of like the same thing with these guys. If you're doing a proper bridge rig glue, you shouldn't need to replace the screws under there. You should just be able to pull them out. So that's what I did. It just reduces the weight. And, you know, if you ever really want to, you could even kind of fill these in with some actual rosewood plugs or something like that and just make it look a little nicer. Because personally, I always think it looks a little cheap to have those inlay dots on there, because I know what's under them. It's probably just a luthier thing, but you know, there's lots of fine guitars that have these bolts and have the things. It's just, I look at it and I'm like, oh man, it's like seeing a mold line on a piece of injection molded plastic or something. It's just like, oh, I see how this is made. So anyway, cool old Aria, you know, and it's gonna have a new life, and that's what it's all about. It's giving these instruments a new life. So this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Feel free to check out the other videos on my channel. I've got a lot of you know, tips and cool little, you know, explorations into my job here, which is to fix up old guitars and repair stuff that's been damaged. I can take questions. I respond to them best if you give them to me over Patreon or over my Ko-Fi. I will get to those very quickly. If you leave questions down in the comments, I may get to them eventually, but I do ask that, like, long form questions, you know, get sent to the Ko-Fi, just because it does take a while to answer those, and I'm willing to sit with somebody and really, you know, help somebody out. Just it also helps me out if I'm getting paid for my work. Anyway, in that description of the video, you'll find the links to my Patreon and my Ko-Fi. You'll also find a link to my website where I have my pricing and my contact info, as well as a page that I wrote for caring for stringed instruments. And if you're here watching this video, I'm going to guess that you have a few stringed instruments laying around that you may want to care for. This has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.